Hi everybody, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Anubha Bhonsle and you've joined us here on Newsworthy. I'm bringing into focus an issue I have a feeling we're going to discuss a lot of in the days ahead. I'm going to dive right into what we're going to discuss today. Many of you would know the government's latest warning to Twitter to reblock access to some of its account on its platform that were related to the farmers' protests. If you've sort of skipped a little bit of pieces of this news, let me just do a quick recap and sort of list out the sequence of events, so to speak. Remember, it was Monday when Twitter had originally complied with a government request and suspended access to about 200 odd Twitter accounts in India. Many of these accounts were related to the farmers' protests. There was an account called the Kisan Ekta Morcha that was standing in support of the farmers' protests. An account called Tractor to Twitter, again standing in support. The account of the very influential investigative magazine called Caravan, account of a couple of lawmakers, account of the CEO of Prasar Bharati. And the sense one had was that many of these accounts the government had asked Twitter to withhold or block for a period of time because they were using a problematic hashtag, so to speak. This particular request was made under what's called Section 69A of the Information Technology Act. Many of you may feel it's a bit of jargon, but I would urge you to stick around because it's a really interesting nugget of the Information Technology Act, and it effectively allows the government to tell intermediaries, which is essentially social media companies, to block accounts in the interest of public order, national security, the country's sovereignty, so to speak. And there are some very problematic aspects about Section 69A. Now, these accounts were withheld, and really in a couple of hours, Twitter unblocked the accounts because there was widespread criticism that this was curtailing freedom of speech. Twitter was clamping down on freedom of speech. Why did they have different standards in the West, different standards in India, and Twitter therefore unblocked those accounts? Well, this has actually led to a fresh warning that's coming from the government on Tuesday, where the government has essentially said that the restoration of those accounts, Twitter restoring those accounts, is really, in a sense, a violation of the judicial process. There's a lot to unpack here, and I am extremely excited and privileged to patch in the executive director of the Internet Freedom Foundation's Apar Gupta. As I patch him in, let me do a brief introduction, and I'm sure he'll be able to hear that as well. Joining us any minute. If you, in all likelihood, you know about the organization. In all likelihood, heard Apar speak on this issue. He's one of the most clarifying voices when it comes to free speech, digital rights, and really all the freedoms in this digital world. And yes, I can see Apar right there. Apar, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here, Anubha.
How are you? How are you doing? There's a
I'm
lot
doing,
happening.
yeah, I'm doing quite well. One hopes it was under calmer times, but excited to also share with all our viewers explanation of what's actually happening these days with regard to web censorship.
Great. So let's sort of dive straight in. Before you had joined in and I had patched you in, I'd sort of given a brief reckoner or a sequence of events. मैंने chronology समझा दी थी लोगों को कि कैसे एक request दिया गया, Twitter ने उसको comply किया, और फिर अब Twitter के पास एक fresh warning आई है. Apar, is there anything about this sequence of events that surprises you? Were you surprised when Twitter decided to withhold the accounts? Were you surprised when Twitter decided to unblock the accounts? And are you surprised now of the government's latest warning?
I think I was surprised from the very beginning because it seemed as if a direction was given to block user accounts rather than specific tweets. So what the government usually does, if it doesn't like something on the internet and issues a blocking direction, it's there for that specific page on a social media platform usually, not for the entire account by itself. And the number of accounts also seemed very, very large, which is why a lot of users who may be in this live and maybe on Twitter saw a trending hashtag. So the entire extent of the government direction was one which took me up by surprise also. And secondly, who it was directed against also seemed fairly excessive, because it was, for instance, against the Caravan's Twitter account, and it was also against the Prasar Bharati chief, Mr. Shashi Shekhar's account. And one was just left wondering in a space of confusion what's actually happening. Of course, there were some press reports, but because the entire process is secret, it all remains speculative that this was because of a hashtag. And this is why all the accounts, about 200 of them, which were directed to be blocked by Twitter, by the government, actually were blocked, but one does not have the order and one does not have press release. So there was a lot of confusion, speculation. Secondly, what's surprising here in the sequence you narrated, Anubha, is that Twitter actually pushes back the government and says that we think that this is disproportionate, or we think this is overbroad. Does not know what's happened in that conversation, but it seems as that for the first time, an online social media entity in India is the legal consequence, which is actually imprisonment in this case, up to 7. So it's quite a major escalation in this ongoing controversy about whether foreign Silicon Valley companies stand for their users, if foreign Silicon Valley companies apply a free speech standard, if foreign Silicon Valley is also considering themselves exceptional to Indian law, it depends where the person is sitting, right? But by itself, that event is significant. So in both these respects, firstly, the government's response, and secondly, Twitter's lack of lack of compliance with it, because it may have taken a deeper legal study. I'm interested in getting into it a little more, but both of them are very significant.
So I think it's an important part you sort of underline, that Twitter's sort of pushback, or Twitter's lack of compliance with the government order, because in this fresh warning that the government has issued to Twitter, they've said it very clearly that the restoration of these accounts is in violation of the judicial process. Twitter was not following the law of the land, and under Section 69A, intermediaries that fail to comply with government directives may be punished, as you said, with an imprisonment for a term which may extend to 7 years and shall be liable to fine. You must remember that Twitter does have employees here in India. So this is a sort of, if I can call it within quotes, a sort of brave move or a brave pushback. Apar, you mentioned in your answer that you were surprised because normally it's a particular tweet or, it's a particular narrative that the government seeks to block. But in this case, it's a hashtag. Now, or at least from media reports, we know it's a hashtag.
In the past, there have been directions with hashtags on the past, but I don't know how they have been complied. We did catalog one such instance, but even in that, usually the accounts also which are sought to be suspended are usually accounts which are not mainstream news publications. Or even if we don't consider Caravan to be mainstream, it's a well-functioning journal of culture and politics. So it does seem as if the threshold for the exercise of censorship has just grown. And there were so many commentators also whose accounts were blocked. It seems like a fairly drastic move. Now, in terms of what you just read out, which was that Twitter, and this carries that timeline a little forward. Twitter refuses, and the government again comes back and says that, hey, if you're not complying with the directions, it's a violation of XYZ. Now, again, that entire letter, that reinstatement, I have not seen it. I think it's technically, again, a secret document, if I'm not wrong.
I'm quoting this from a ministry spokesperson saying it to the Financial Times.
Yes. This is a off-the-record background kind of statement. This is again not the text of what is its correspondence with Twitter. And I would be surprised they would say judicial process, because judicial process presupposes a direction by a court body. But here, from other news stories, it appears that there was an emergency blocking request which was given under Rule 9 of the rules, which is purely executive. It involves no court case. Just to break it down, there are two ways how websites can be blocked under Section 69A. One is by the government by itself, okay? And the second is when a court order or direction is sent to the government, and government is merely acting like a post office and putting a covering letter on top of it and sending it to an intermediary. I don't think so. This is the latter. I think this is the
Yes, this is the former. Apar, just for the sake of people who are interested in this, how does the nuts and bolts of Section 69A work? So we know so little about why these accounts were asked to be withheld. I mean, even if we were to look at a hashtag, many people would say that, for instance, the Prasar Bharati CEO was critiquing the hashtag. For instance, a lot of narrative around the hashtag could be even sort of against the hashtag. Even if I was to sort of play the devil's advocate and let's say that the hashtag in itself is sort of problematic, how does Section 69A work? Is this a government committee sitting and saying this is a problematic hashtag?
Yeah, and the funny thing is, it's not checking what it's doing, and it's sometimes even suspending the accounts of government officers who are defending it. But it's reading that information acontextually. It's like somebody popping into the next room and saying, "Yeah, just find out the top 300 tweets with this tag," without even reading them. And this is a natural outcome of secrecy. This is what happens in secret societies, which is what is explained even by, for instance, if anybody loves literature about Franz Kafka, he's always, his protagonist is stumbling into one thing or the other and trying to discover, why am I visiting this horrible consequence? And this is a product of Section 69A of the Information Technology Act, which gives the government power actually to direct blocking of any web resource. This is the same power which was used to direct blocking of all those quote unquote Chinese smartphone applications, if you remember. Okay. Yeah. And there's another provision below that which says that the central government can prescribe process. So the parliament makes this law and the central government makes a process in 2009. This process basically establishes a committee which is called the Committee to Examine Requests for Blocking. It can make a blocking which are the eventual order to block what it wants to a internet service provider like website blocking, or even to an intermediary such as or Facebook to take down a page or a user account. Okay, and these kind of directions are issued in two further subcategories. One is called emergency requests, where it does not even send a notice to the intermediary. Hold on for a second, it's getting complex, so I'll make it simple. So essentially what it does is, one, without doing anything, it just directly publishes the order, or secondly, it is complies with what is called as a show cause notice. You go there, you give your evidence, and you basically participate, and you have a challenge in terms of a process that you won't be censored if you can actually establish to the satisfaction of this government body that you have not done anything objectionable. From what it seems in this instant case, this was an emergency direction, so there was no hearing. Another interesting tidbit about this is the notices don't go to the actual Twitter accounts. The government has the discretion of sending the notice actually to Twitter, the intermediary. And the intermediary usually does not have the full facts why a specific tweet was authored, and does not have the interest which would be there, for instance, with Caravan magazine to say, what the hell are you doing? We are a journalistic publication and we use hashtag in the context of this story. So Twitter won't be able to lawyer it out like that with them. And one final thing on this is that this is a recurring pattern of absurdity in this censorship design, which emerges from lack of transparency. In fact, there's a case in the Delhi High Court right now concerning a satire website called Dowry Calculator, and all of us at Internet Freedom Foundation have been working on it. That displays how absurd the website blocking process is because of secrecy.
Apar, you mentioned the Chinese apps, but isn't it true that when the government applied Section 69A to the Chinese app, it came out sort of in full bravado and put out a press release and told us what was problematic? So there is sort of this transparency and public posturing when you apply Section 69A to a set of Chinese apps, but not so now. How does that work?
So, you know, when they directed that the Chinese apps be blocked by itself, they put out a press release that very day with about 3 paragraphs and an appendix. But again, the legal order was not there. So the text of the legal order was absent, and also the press release had certain vague basis for the directions. Another thing to consider is that all the 49 apps were not even called Chinese. Okay, and the reasons and the 3 paragraphs were very vague. They were not specific. There were no there were not technical audits of the 49 apps because they had different companies associated with it who owned them, different functionalities, different sets of data they gathered. So one of the reasoning was not only national security but the data protection and the privacy interests of the end user. So one does not really know that what is the legal order, what were the inputs, and the inputs also seemed like one government department received complaints, and essentially the Home Ministry forwarded a report. But what was the assessment done technically, legally? That's not. It's very poor for a rule of law system for a democratic country. And this is what happens when you permit it happening without a legal process, without that level of transparency for 49 Chinese apps, and possibly people like me who are a little older, who whenever you think about even prior to the lockdown, you saw people shooting TikTok videos and you grew irritated. And yeah, older people do get irritated with TikTok videos, and you're like, "Acha hua, TikTok bad ho gaya." The people are saved. If you play to your biases like that, and you say, "Okay, so what if the order was not transparent? Government is saying something here or there." Then it could happen to your favorite magazine also. So I just want to make this example to show that the problem actually is with the legal regulation. And if I have to further pinpoint what it is, it's an absence of transparency, because the fundamental right to freedom of speech not only means the fundamental right of the user, it is also our in this age of social media to receive knowledge and to engage in conversation with people online.
So when Twitter gave those accounts back or restored access to those accounts, apart, it did apply sort of some parameters of its own, right? I mean, it sort of
Yes.
did a deeper dive, it did a deeper study, and it did,
Yeah.
and it did sort of act unilaterally against the government.
Yeah.
What sort of prevented it from taking the same stand in the first instance when the
Because
first time the government said?
So I think they were complying with the process actually. So after the emergency blocking direction under Rule 9 of the blocking rules is given, uh, the intermediary, which happens to be Twitter in this instance, can appear before the government and essentially say, "This is why your order is bad. We've acknowledged it. We've complied with it, and now we are taking A, B, C steps which we feel are within the boundaries of not this existing legal process and regulation with which we have shown good faith, but we've taken our time and we put it down immediately because we comply with your legal system." But at the same point in time, the fundamental rights and our constitutional assessment of this is that your order by itself is overbroad, and this is why we can't continue this compliance anymore. So if they have received this legal advice, and this part is speculative, what they have
Yes.
essentially done is at the first instance complied with the order, shown good faith, assessed its legality, and then gone back and told the government that the order does not hold good as per A, B, C reasons.
In the same landscape, I want to put out another example of the Twitter account of Donald Trump, right? Many would say that Twitter sort of acted against the former president a tad too late. Much damage had been done. But at the same time, when that happened, I saw a fabulous statement, I think, by the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, who said that this is an extremely problematic scenario. This works on our side of the politics right now, so we are happy and cheering it on. But this is an extremely problematic scenario if the CEO of a company is going to decide whether the head of state of one of the countries is going to have a Twitter account or not. How do we navigate that in this scenario?
So there's the thinking which is coming from digital rights organizations is that there needs to be a greater degree of predictability and public accountability for how platforms are behaving with respect to public officials, the general public, and everyone in general. I think the Silicon Valley companies now have an expectation of not only being large corporations which provide us an avenue for conversation, but being a public square. And being a public square is very different. It means that you're no longer a private mall in which there are only shops. It means you're a nukkad in a sense, right? And you're essential for the flow of traffic and people. And just in the online space, the analogy would be ideas and conversation. So there's a greater need for accountability and transparency here. These are two very good principles to go by. People in the digital rights sector keep repeating them. The second, much more specific to what you just said, is that it becomes more and more problematic as we start getting closer to what are called the network layers. So you divide in internet infrastructure in terms of what is really necessary for you to get to that level of digital communication. And the first is essentially a smartphone and a connection to the internet. And the second is usually, if you're a creator, access to web space. So and the third is possibly an email account on an email service provider. So your email service provider can't exist if it doesn't have web space. So they are basically saying that if somebody takes away your ISP, you are basically in complete darkness. If somebody takes away and makes a unilateral decision, a private company, which is ISP like this, it's worse for you, and you have no driving accountability. And this becomes a little less worse, but even then, really critical if it's a predominant company like Amazon Web Services, on which most of the world, including governments, store their data, right? And you just can't build a business. You just can't do anything because you need web storage on the cloud today. And it applies really bad if Google bans you. And but it's a little less worse, but still really significant if Twitter bans you, right? And you can't even get on it again. So it has impact on not only your relationships, your daily chatter, but for a lot of people who are creators, a lot of people who are public officials, reach, interaction, financial side impacts, which is why there needs to be a larger level of transparency which comes in as to what are these norms, what principles are they following, and how are these decisions being taken today. I think this is not a very clear place where you can come easy solutions. And a lot of people will say that, hey, Donald Trump was essentially instigating a insurrection. And people on US broadcast say insurrection, and a small bit of me laughs inside. But I definitely remember it was a real insurrection which was attempted, right? So this is a very, very tough thing for us to actually think about. And especially for us in India, where politicians have been known frequently to make heat speeches in the past and have also done so on digital platforms, it becomes really significant.
Apar, one of the most striking things for me when this particular story was breaking was that, there are so many examples of hate speech, slurs, trolling, threats, especially on sexual violence against women, all of that in this spectrum. Has the government ever used its powers of Section 69A, etc., for ever the citizen? Like in this case, it just seems that, this particular hashtag was directed towards the prime minister, and here's the government saying no criticism against, the prime minister or against anything that we're doing related to the farm laws. Has the government ever used this for the citizen? And any examples of that?
So I'm reminded of a interview with Sham Benegal when he was asked that how's film censorship been exercised, and he said that yes, in some categories political, but mostly related to what they consider obscenity and Indian morals, and that's the story of website blocking also. From the few blocking orders which come to be public, of course, the much more political side censorship has been on the rise. We can just know it through the outcome. But historically, and even with this government and the governments in the past, it's been with respect to obscenity. And here's the thing, guys. I know that a lot of people will not think the government is acting for them when it's blocking a porn website, but this is the government actually trying to save us from really bad influences in its own mind. It's acting like a over-concerned parent. And so just to answer your question, Anubha, yes, the state does think it has acted in citizen interest by banning porn websites.
Apar, I know we kept you for just half an hour and we had a whole spectrum, but somehow we've managed to stick really to this conversation only. I'll just take in a couple of questions and see if we can get you to answer them. A lot of people have said hi to you and are really happy that you've joined in Apar, which means that we should do another one on sort of the entire spectrum of work that you're doing on digital rights and freedom. We also haven't got a chance, Apar, to talk about what is now a frequent. You know, I remember when I used to go to Kashmir, people used to say कि अरे आपने कभी internet ban नहीं देखा है, आपने कभी 2G में काम नहीं किया, you're not used to it. But somehow a lot of that is now happening in India. A lot of that is happening in Delhi on our borders now. So internet ban and sort of at the first sign of dissent or at the first sign of wanting to clamp down, banning internet for specific parts of the national capital is now pretty much is becoming an increasingly standard practice. Do you want to just respond to that while I just looking for a couple of questions for you?
Yeah, the thing is the internet bans commenced sometime in 2011, 2012 around Republic and Independence Day in Kashmir, and it was cited for security reasons. Back then, they didn't even have developed legal legislation. Then it crept into other areas when there were large protests. For instance, the Patidar agitation. Gujarat was one of the first instances we saw it. Then we saw it also in Haryana when the Jat reservation was happening, and in Rajasthan it happened and then became a administrative practice. So people will be surprised that Rajasthan the internet very frequently. In Darjeeling, it was shut close to 100 days. West Bengal also does it. Okay, so it seems to become a natural day in the administrator's toolkit to deal with any kind of local disturbance. I think there needs to be a great amount of sensitization of district magistrates for the routine internet shutdowns which are being done. For instance, you'll be shocked that internet shutdowns have been done to prevent cheating in exams in entire districts. And the only way a person can enter that examination hall is through a digital ID card. And so a person is sent a SMS 2 days before the exam to download it in advance in their phone and then come to the exam hall. This is the level of absurdities it's reached. But it's really bad and frightening, proportionate as a measure. It shuts down an entire medium of communication. It shuts down pretty much a region today. And I think as we are going towards the Internet of Things, internet shutdowns by themselves become more and more not only but unconscionable.
Apar, I think there is a long list of questions and possibly we'll send it to your account to answer individually some of them. But I think there are two broad threads that have come. One, are people just interested in knowing if there are penal provisions that can be sort of put against Twitter if they continue to have their stand? And the second one about these developments and our comparisons with China.
So the first is answered again, just going by Section 69A of the IT Act itself. So if you look at Section 69A, it says at the bottom by itself that a non-compliance leads to the intermediary. It's in subclause 3. The intermediary who fails to comply with the direction issued under subsection 1 shall be punished with the imprisonment for a term which may extend to 7 years and shall also be liable to fine. So that's number one. Number two, comparisons to China, still a long way to go, I would say, but are we on that path? Honestly, I would say yes, we are on that path. And that's a very bad to take, because one of the best things to come out of the internet has been that awakening of a chaotic democracy. I know it has very few fans. I'm one of the fans, where I think a lot of people in India who never had a voice in terms of discussing politics, and they may not be doing it in the most civic way right now. You may not think that they are long or very deep explanations of opinions, but these are opinions they hold, and they can express it for the first time. They demand accountability from the legislators and ministers. And even though I personally was not a big fan of, for instance, people directly tagging Sushma Swaraj and asking her for help with their passports, it just showed that our civic administrators, our public officials are responsive. They're here to help. So it has so much democratic potential. And if we go down the path of China, we lose that, right? And this is one of the very reasons we adopted a constitution with certain fundamental values. So going down that path of by banning, by shutting down voices which are politically inconvenient, may lead to a short-term interest or benefit for us. But in the long term, it goes it out. At the very least, what people need to know are the reasons why this censorship is being caused. And a legal remedy also then exists for them, whether they can challenge it. I would say that even if censorship is being done for good reasons and it is done in democracies, it needs to be done under a legal process which is constitutional and transparent.
So I think that sort of sums it up perfectly, that even if we were to do censorship, we need to know why, and there needs to be greater transparency. Apar, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. And just once again, a reminder to anyone who's joined in for this conversation, do log on to all of Apar's work and his team's work at the Internet Freedom Foundation. And we'd love to get him on once again to join us. Okay, guys, that's it from us. We'll put out this particular video on our stream as well again. And if there are, and I do believe there are a whole lot of other questions that haven't got answered, we'll try and put them for Apar and his organization and possibly bring him on for another live. Thank you so much.